Conversations, where I like to talk with interesting people that I have met on my travels and my digital escapades, people that are doing things that I find hopeful and interesting. Hope, as I've discussed on this show, is one of the three Christian virtues, and I think it might be one of the most needful and neglected virtues of our time because there's so much change out there that gives us opportunity for despair. And people like us who love the great books and the classics and know how fragile all good things are, we're prone to despair. It's very easy and tempting to spin out disaster scenarios. But every disaster scenario is only a prediction of the future. It hasn't happened yet, doesn't have to happen. It's not written in stone. Nothing is destined. I believe very firmly that things are up to us. And even though the world is going to change and keep changing, we are going to have agency and we're going to have a choice, as Gandalf says, of what to do with the time that is given us. And so my guest today, Johnathan Bi, is somebody that really, I'm going to let him introduce himself, but I'm really interested in the way that our paths have crossed. If you've been listening to me recently, you know that I've developed an interest in math and science, and I've got my books behind me on black body discontinuity, and there's I think I've got Einstein behind me as well, and this has become, philosophy of science has become a major sort of part of my academic profile, or one of my major interests. And that's because as I have delved most deeply into the things that I love best, which are the classics, the literary classics, moral philosophy and literature, I have come to feel very strongly that everything is interconnected and that our seemingly sort of STEM problems, our math and science problems and our technology problems that are making the news are also, and in some profound sense, humanities problems. They're problems about cosmic questions. How do we fit into the universe? What's our purpose? And so on and so forth. And Johnathan is somebody, interestingly, who came at that conclusion from exactly the opposite starting points. So I began in the humanities and have moved into an interest in math and science. Johnathan began in the hard sciences and has moved into an awareness of how necessary it is to study the classics and to study the Western canon and humanities. And he's got a new series of lectures and interviews coming out that is about this, in some sense, the journey of a hard scientist or a person with a background in math and science and computer engineering, the journey of a STEM guy through and into the humanities and into a deeper awareness of the good life. So I just think that's really important. I think we're entering a period in intellectual history when, although it's still important to know at least one subject very, very well, and although expertise and specialism are always going to have their place, I think we're moving away from the time when that was the height of academic achievement and toward a time when synthesis is important and when cross-disciplinary conversations like the one I'm about to have become really urgent. So without further ado, let's do it. Let's talk to Johnathan Bi. All right, so I'm here with Johnathan Bi, whom I hardly know how to introduce. He's, let's see, an entrepreneur, he's a philosopher, he's a podcaster, or at least a YouTube creator. You've done a very successful series on Rene Girard, who's somebody we have talked about on this show. Now you've got a new one on the great books of the West, including interviews and lectures. But maybe we can just start there. And why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your story and how you would describe yourself at this point, what got you interested in the Western canon, and we'll go from there.
Great. So I was born in Beijing. I moved to Vancouver when I was 3. I moved back to Beijing when I was 6. If you ask my parents why, they'll tell you it was for my education. If the real reason was we ran out of money. One thing that might surprise people is that growing up, I hated the humanities. Humanities education is for losers, essentially, is what I was brought up to be trained into. And I think
I've
this is
never seen any
quite
evidence to the contrary of that, speaking as a lifelong humanist.
um, I was reading Nietzsche's biography, and apparently in Nietzsche's school, at least, I'm not sure if this was true for Germany at the time, but the smart people went into classics, and sort of math, at least, wasn't properly taught to Nietzsche, and so he never really got into it. I think in modernity, that is exactly reversed, and where the smartest kids are all pushed into STEM because it's objective. There's a right or wrong answer. It's easier to measure and quantify, and I definitely got pushed into that. So I was trained. This is back in Beijing, to go into that whole mathlete Olympiad route, and I was also trained with a disdain for the humanities. When I was 15, I moved back to Vancouver, and I got really into coding, and I wanted to be an entrepreneur. As soon as I got into college, I dropped out one semester in, raised friends and family around, and failed my first startup. And that's how I got into the humanities. So the reason the startup failed had nothing to do with me failing to reach some kind of goal. It was a failure of desire. It was I didn't really want to do the startup in the first place. And in hindsight, what had really happened is that I had fallen into this Zuckerberg complex, is what I like to call, that dropping out is the cool thing to do these days.
Right.
The joke I have is, Peter Thiel, who really pioneered this or strongly encouraged this dropout culture with the Thiel Fellowship and other endeavors, did too good of a job. And now dropping out is no longer contrarian. It's cool. And people who shouldn't have dropped out do because of that cool factor. And I definitely fell prey to that. And it was because this was an internal failure that I felt like I needed to debug myself, right? This was clearly an issue of me and not of me versus the world. And as any engineer worth his salt, I started looking for what the API document, what the instruction manual for the human person is. And I tried many different things, psychology, therapy, but philosophy was really where I found the most complete manual. And so I got into mostly otherworldly thinkers and philosophies, Girard and Catholicism, as well as some of the Tibetan Buddhists, because they also problematize desire. And it's the problematic desire that really led me initially into philosophy. Now, to speed up a bit, because I've been talking for too long, when I was graduating, I wanted to continue pursuing philosophy because I had fallen in love with it, but even more than the utilitarian, instrumental, how do I live a good life motivation that motivated me there. But when I was looking at a philosophy PhD, a path that's a philosophy PhD, that's what I wanted to do. It seemed like a lot of them were quite miserable, including the early professor track. And so if at the end of the day, I was doing this to live a good life, but for some mysterious reason, unbeknownst to me, it seemed to thwart the good life, then what's the point of doing philosophy? And so I had some very well-meaning professors who encouraged me to sort of establish myself independently first. And so I did that. I had the skill set already to be an entrepreneur. I studied computer science as well as philosophy. So I went and built a company. I built a company with a gentleman by the name of Joe Lonsdale. He started the University of Boston, Palantir, and other great organizations. And we had built a company that was going great. And 3.5 years into the company, I had this burning desire to go back into philosophy. And despite my Chinese parents' strong disapproval of me leaving such a lucrative career, I decided a few months ago to go back into philosophy. And what I wanted to do primarily was I felt like I still needed exposure to the canon, that I haven't gotten enough of a breadth. There were deep questions that I was interested in, but I still have no idea what Pascal or Spinoza said, or I still haven't read The Republic or City of God cover to cover, and that just seems unconscionable. And I felt like that was the next step of my journey as of my personal growth as a scholar. And so it didn't seem like a PhD would be the best way to satisfy that yearning and that curiosity. So what I'm doing instead is I'm creating, as you mentioned, a lecture and interview series on the great books. Every 6 weeks, I spend with one great book. We're launching with Nietzsche and Rousseau, Rousseau's first two discourses and Nietzsche's genealogy. And I get to interview some of the top professors who've read secondary literature on it. And so that is it's, of the entire 6 weeks, I basically interview two top professors, two or three top professors, and then I force myself to give a 2 hour lecture, introductory lecture to this. So hopefully the output of this is also interesting to other people.
Absolutely. Your description of your Chinese parents reminds me just a little bit of one of my favorite kind of Instagram. I guess he's actually on TikTok, but I see his reels on Instagram. And he's Korean, but he does this routine where he'll say what you say versus what your Korean parents hear. And one of them is you say, I want to be an artist, and they hear, I want to be broke. And there is, I think, I mean, I don't actually think that that's culturally limited now to any one nation or culture. I do think, as you indicate, that what the founders of the scientific revolution might have called primary qualities, the quantifiable things, have taken this enormous primacy, or until very recently they had this enormous primacy, and now I think people are starting to question that a little bit after COVID, and after having seen the ways in which science too is susceptible to political manipulation and requires a larger interpretational framework. I have felt for a while like maybe we're entering the age of the generalist. In fact, Nietzsche, whom, as you mentioned, you've spent some time with, wrote an essay that has always stuck with me called "Wir Philologen," we classicists, essentially, we academics, and it's about the ways in which expertise and specialism kind of narrows your field of vision, and actually in some ways makes you less able to understand even your area of supposed expertise. And so I'm talking to a lot of people, and I myself have branched out beyond my own kind of narrow academic field. I'm talking to a lot of people who are saying, no, actually, it's a time for gathering together. It's a time for expanding and talking across disciplines and trying to understand a governing picture of the whole. And so with that in mind, I was curious about your choice actually of thinkers. There's obviously a huge field available to you. As you say, there's always that feeling, I'm sure a lot of listeners can relate, of overwhelm that doesn't go away. By the way, it won't stop once you've read the Republic. It doesn't stop once you've read Pascal. There's always just so much out there. But I'm curious. It seems like you have a very specific set of ideas in mind, or aim in mind, maybe to do with modernity. But you tell me, why Nietzsche, why
Yeah.
Rousseau, why these thinkers?
So let me make a comment on the specialist versus generalist thing first, which
Yeah.
is, I want to be clear, and I don't think you're saying this either. I do think there's great value to the academy, which is why I'm spending most of my time interviewing top professors in the academy. The point I was making was a contingent one, that what I want to do right now is not a good fit for the academy. But there are many intellectual projects that I am interested in that would be a great fit for the academy in a PhD program, which I might find myself in again. Um, so that's the first caveat there. The second thing is that in a world where there are only specialists, perhaps becoming a generalist is a form of specialization, where it becomes extremely differentiating. Now, to answer your question directly, I chose Nietzsche and Rousseau for a great reason, because I think you got it, because they flank modernity, right? Traditionally, Rousseau is thought of flanking modernity in the left wing, and Nietzsche on the right wing. But they're all very hostile to modernity in their own ways, right? And the books or the discourses that I chose to begin with are all extremely hostile to core and fundamental beliefs that we hold. I mean, Nietzsche in the genealogy attacks not only Christianity, but the basis of Christianity, which he considers to be this egalitarian, what he calls slave morality. And Rousseau's first discourse is infamously an attack on science, philosophy, and art, right? Things that you never hear criticized in modern discourse. I wanted to start with those authors because I wanted to show people what they could be missing if they don't engage with these books. There's another path that I could have started with, and that's that's Locke and and mill, and defending free speech, defending private property, and eventually I'm going to do that. But I'm worried that it would make people think that studying the Western canon should just be about affirming our existing intuitions, and instead of challenging them. And I don't think most people, before they read the first discourse, will hear a serious, systematic attack on reason itself, right, or on the intellect. And so that's part of the reason why I started with them. But the entire project is not this whole contrarian critical enterprise. That's just the starting point. Yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. One of the things that I've been emphasizing or chewing over on the show recently is that somehow we've developed this story about, for example, the scientific revolution, that it's a transition from doubt and superstition and mystery into reason, clarity, and certainty. When in fact, as you indicate, when you go back and read the primary text, what you find is a whole lot of doubt that's tangled up with the Protestant Reformation and with questioning previously settled ideas, and a lot of diffidence and critique. I mean, modernity almost begins with a critique of modernity already. It comes self-critiquing, which perhaps is why Hamlet is the great play that inaugurates this whole history. Do you feel that, I mean, obviously we've had now post-modernity, and some would say post-modernity, but it's not clear to me that anything has really quite come next, or that we see the shape of where we're going next. Do you feel as if, modernity is coming to an end, or this whole tradition that you're trying to understand is part of the project, I guess, trying to figure out where we go from here?
Yeah, definitely. I think
Hmm.
one of the best things you can do to prepare for the future is to read these old books, and
Hmm.
that's going to seem like a crazy idea to people like me who grew up only in STEM, right? Like, what could
Yeah.
Plato possibly teach me about where we're headed to next? But I think by reading these books, not only will we learn how we got here, it shows the alternative paths that we didn't take, and
Hmm.
therefore the paths that we potentially could take. So, as I mentioned previously, I did not grow up sort of steeped into the humanities. For me, it's quite practical reasons that are motivating me to read these books. Initially, it was with the good life, and it's still around the good life. But I soon learned that you can't live the good life without the world being shaped in some hospitable way. And
Hmm.
so, I'm very concerned with history and where it takes us. And those practical reasons are why I'm engaging this project, even when this project leads me down seemingly unrelated metaphysical rabbit holes. And just to give you an
Hmm.
idea why I think, I'm in one of the trailers that I made for this entire project, I said, history has not come to an end, but the end of history has.
Yeah.
And I think the reason is two things. One that's, I think, obvious to everyone already, and the second one is less obvious. The first one is geopolitics, right? Even in the last
Hmm.
year with Israel, with Russia and Ukraine, there's a feeling that the era of peace that you and I both grew up in is coming to some kind of
Yeah.
end, or at least there's something that's different. The other factor is technology. Um,
Hmm.
just in the last 2 years alone, the advance in AI, which is just the beginning, all the cool stuff and potentially terrifying stuff coming down the pipeline, like Neuralink that you covered, or advances in biotechnology that's going to fundamentally change human nature itself. These are things that are going to affect us in our lifetime. And I think that reading these books is going to help us better direct and guide where to change. And so let me give you one last example here. In my
Hmm.
second discourse lecture, um, so the second discourse is Rousseau's sort of investigation into the origin of inequality. And to investigate the origin of inequality, he actually reconstructs the whole history of civilization itself. That's how ambitious of a project this is. And I read Rousseau's each stage of of history as being the intersection of our social side. So this is our mimetic side. This is our concern for vanity, for status, and technology. So each stage is marked by a new technology, whether that's metallurgy, whether that's
Mm.
agriculture, whether that's the invention of the political state. And I spent about 10, 20 minutes after talking about that, talking about, well, what that means for our current technological revolutions. How is AI going to affect with our desire for vanity and status and prestige and those social desires? So I think that, yeah, these books have a tremendous power about
Mm.
guiding us in the future.
Yeah, it strikes me, of course, as you indicate, we're thinking along similar lines in a lot of these topics, and it's really fun and exciting to me to meet you in some sense coming in the opposite direction. So, my background very much is in the humanities, and out of a desire to preserve and sustain what's best in the humanities into the digital age, I've become interested, as you say, in things like Neuralink and science and so forth. And you're pointing out that you come from exactly the opposite direction. And in some
Right.
ways, we're like intersecting, right? Like ships passing the night or whatever, which is really cool. And I think is we're not the only people who are having that kind of experience. And one of the places where our paths now overlap, I think, is precisely in this matter of the good life, which is very closely related to the question of our humanity. And both these questions are ancient, but they also, I think, are very acutely raised by the biotechnology that you talk about, the AI. Almost all of these kind of moral problems that we have seem to keep coming back to, well, what are we? What is man? And what's distinctive about that, and how can we sustain that or preserve the best in it and elevate the best in it? And that, of course, is a central concern of the really the entire canon, and it's a central concern of yours as well. Knowing what it is to be human is in some sense knowing what it is to be good at being human, and vice versa. Knowing about the good life means or requires knowing about being human. So could you talk to me a little bit about, you said that some of that was lacking from your experience before really delving into the great books. You talk to me about what was lacking, and what so far has really stuck out to you as maybe some central, even not if not principles, then issues or things to be aware of when it comes to this urgent matter of our humanity.
I think what we are overlooking, and my Girardian training is going to come through here, is really
Uh-huh.
our social mimetic side. And this
Mm,
has been a consistent thread through all of the authors that I'm interested in. I had the great
mm,
fortune of studying under some great continental philosophy theorists at Columbia, and they described their school as recognition theory. This idea
mm,
that a core good that humanity desires is not tables and chairs or even sex or food or shelter that animals also desire, but it's social goods like vanity,
mm,
like pride, like status. And it's these type of things that really drive society. And in fact,
mm,
what's really interesting about these thinkers, and I'm thinking in the the British, sorry, uh, the German tradition, people like Hegel and Fichte, people in the French tradition, like Rousseau and Sartre and Girard, and people like Smith and Hume. And most of these thinkers also think that we deceive ourselves about the social side of human nature.
mm.
So we might say, no, I'm going to this fine dining restaurant because the food is great. That's rarely the case
Right,
for people who do
right.
fine dining, right? It's mostly the case for that you want to have conceive of yourself as having a certain status. So
Yeah.
that was, like I mentioned, what led me astray. I thought I wanted to build the company for its own sake, to drop out and build the company for its own sake, but it really was this mimetic social desire. And I think the even more interesting manifestation of that in modernity is that people are now conforming to contrarianism. So, one way
Mm,
that people hide how these social drives determine them is by trying to break free from the group. But of course,
mhm.
trying to break free is also a form of being determined by the group. There's a movie
Yep.
that Marlon Brando was in called The Wild Ones in the mid 20th century, and he was this caricature of this rebellious, independent minded, cool guy. Right? He got the biker
Mm,
jacket. He's got a beautiful girl around his arm. And then someone asks him, what are you rebelling against? He's got a slanted hat on. And he says, what do you got? Right? So like whatever you put in front of him, he's going to rebel against. And that's also a
Right.
form of social determination.
Mm.
So that part of humanity, the social, recognitive, mimetic part, is something
Mm.
I personally am deeply fascinated by, which is also another reason that I started with Nietzsche, who thinks that Christians didn't hold the values of compassion and equality and poverty and meekness for their own sake, but in some
Right.
sense to secure victory over the
Hmm.
masters, right, over the Greco-Roman, the elites. And Rousseau, obviously, who's in many ways, the founder of this entire tradition with his idea of amour propre, right? The desire for
Hmm.
recognition. And let me just add one more thing, if it's okay, to connect this back to
Please.
this idea of technology. I talk about this in my second discourse lecture, but if we do think that the recognition theorists are right, that so much of society is determined on the logic of recognition rather than absolute goods, what's going to happen to society when a large part of people start caring about the recognition of non-human intelligent agents? And
Hmm.
this might sound like a dystopian world, but this has already happened with
Yep.
romance chatbots with Replica, right? The famous story
Hmm.
of Replica is that it was this AI companion, and it mostly serves people on the fringes of society, right? People who are unfortunately abused or have trouble forming romantic relationships, and they had a deep attachment as if it were a
Hmm.
real person. Now, as soon as the underlying models changed and
Hmm.
the behavior of the romantic partners changed completely, you read the posts on the Reddit forums, people were like literally suicidal, as if a loved one
Hmm.
had like passed. So one thing you could dismiss this and say, no, this is just a fringe behavior. But pornography was a fringe behavior until OnlyFans brought it mainstream, right? I think technology always starts from these early adopters and then pushes it into the mainstream. So if you think that most of that we're all going to have AI companions, maybe not romantic ones, but AI companions in some regard, then it becomes a very, very important question to answer. Do we care about the recognition from AI agents? Because if we
Hmm.
do, that might splinter the very fabric of what holds society together, if these recognition
Hmm.
theorists are right. So that's something I briefly touch upon in the second discourse lecture, and I'm writing a paper on that. I'm doing some research on that right now. So this is just another
Hmm.
example of why these books are so relevant in this technological age when things are changing so much. I'm almost tempted to say philosophy has never been more relevant than now,
Hmm.
because
Yeah.
philosophy for all of civilization has been dealing with completely useless questions, right?
Yeah.
Can deterministic agents be held morally accountable? Who cares? That's going to
Hmm.
matter when we have self-driving cars roaming around that operate under
Hmm.
deterministic mechanisms, right? Here's another one. Is reason or is sentiment the basis of morality, right? Kant and Rousseau
Hmm.
famously are the two different camps. That's going to matter when we can bioengineer humans to dial up different capacities, cutting off reason or cutting off sentiment, respectively. And if you have the wrong idea of the world, you can really mess things up. So I think
Hmm.
with technology and with also the geopolitical change that I described, I think philosophy has never been more relevant. I'll just say one last thing here.
Oh,
Um,
please.
it appears to me that philosophy is required whenever things really go wrong. Or the less dark version of saying that is whenever there's a lot of change in the world, whether that's Plato
Hmm.
reflecting on the Peloponnesian War, whether that's Augustine trying to reconcile the sack of Rome, whether that's Hegel, right, famously seeing Napoleon, that world spirit riding on horseback. And I think we are also entering in that type of age where there's going to be a lot of change that fundamentally transforms and challenges the existing mental models and how we navigate the world. And I think that's when
Hmm.
philosophy is needed. And in my own life, um, you can match the number of journal entries I make per month to how depressed I'm feeling. The more
That's
journal
funny. Me
entries,
too.
the
No, I have
more
the exact
depressed.
same thing. Yeah.
When I'm happy, I don't write. I don't have to think about
Yeah.
stuff.
Right. Right. Right.
And so yeah, I'll pause there.
No, well, there's a lot that you've said that is really there. There's a lot in what you've said, and I definitely agree with you that we're entering into a high journal entry volume time, which is funny that is something that we share because yeah, no, that I've noticed this as well. In fact, I don't even really journal all that often. I do so much writing just generally that I feel like journaling is not my standard mode, but I sometimes start journaling, and it's always because there's something that I need to work out, and I don't. It took me a while to notice that when I have the impulse to journal, even if I don't know what it is, there's something somewhere that emerges, and then I stop journaling once I've figured it out. Um, but your point about Kant, I think this is the question that I want to sort of use to bring us to a close here. I wanted to draw on something you said about Kant, and the question of morality, because I guess, being a classicist, I would sort of invoke Aristotle here too, and think about virtue ethics and the role of intention in the good, right? That it's not so much a question of, or it is a question of what is good, but it's also a question of wanting the good and who wants the good. And this has become an important feature also of Christian ethics, whether or not it always was. It certainly is now. I was once at a talk with Antonin Scalia, the late great Supreme Court justice, and he said something to the effect of, Jesus cares less about the poor being helped than he does about you helping them, which was a very striking way of putting it. And I'm not
Right.
so
Yeah.
sure that I've always quite agreed, but in fact, I don't totally, I wouldn't co-sign that altogether, but it does highlight this urgent matter, as you say, in the age of AI, where you can have beings that sort of outsource maybe our virtue and do the good things, and yet have, at least so far as we can tell, I would say, no intention, no inner life, which then speaks to that whole broader set of issues that you raised about, well, if you project a personality onto a chatbot and then you fall in love with that chatbot, are you misdirecting your relationality? And then now we're just in this world that an ancient would be very comfortable talking about, of human embeddedness, that in some sense our very identity is wrapped up in the other people that are around us and the networks of people that are around us. And that is all very much at home in, say, the Nicomachean Ethics, but not in modernity, which, especially in its later stages, has this problem of atomization and of the individual, which, again, Hamlet is kind of the archetype of this dissociation from the rest of civilization. And it strikes me that that problem, as you say, becomes particularly acute when many of the entities that we're capable of relating to as if they were other minds might not, in fact, be other minds, but only simulacra of other minds. And therefore, I would like you to help me solve this problem in 5 minutes or less. Just by speaking to this question, is there a version of this that is not adversarial and hopeless and dystopian in a kind of Girardian mimetic way, and that doesn't end us up self and other destructing,
Yeah.
but invites us back maybe into
Right.
the primacy of human connection and the
Right.
premium that is placed on that in the broader scope of history.
I definitely think there is. And I think
Hmm.
Replica, the story that I mentioned, already gives an example of how things could go well.
Hmm.
Before the AI algorithms were changed and people went ballistic, uh, the sort of early adopter, the classical user, or rather the classical good user, was someone who's
Hmm.
unfortunately been abused and or on the fringe of the dating market for some other reason, and they had a lot of trouble forming
Hmm.
healthy romantic relationships because it was a robot. It was lower stakes, and they were able to model healthy modes of recognition and giving recognition to the robot, some of which translated to real people
Hmm.
in their real lives. And so this is one of the things that I'm trying to that we're coming back in. That This is one of the things that we're coming back to in this conversation, which is recognition is so embedded into us, mimesis,
Hmm.
sociality, desire for status and vanity, whatever you want to call it, that the question is not how we get rid of these things. It's how do we align them properly, both in our own lives as
Hmm.
well as in society. And this is, I think, a version of the atomization problem that you're talking about, which is the only reason that we think we can be independent is we think that we don't have to desire the status or the recognition, prestige, vanity, and things. But the ancients and these recognition theorists that I described see that as a constitutive part of what it means to be man. So desiring
Mm-hmm.
the recognition of others, caring what others think, right? The classical thing
Mm.
here in modernity is don't care what other people think. Terrible advice, right? And
Right,
so
right, right.
the if you think that you can stop caring what other people think,
Hmm.
that assumes you're an atom, right? That assumes you're
Yeah,
an
yeah, yeah.
individual that is fully independent. But we are in this interconnected social web, and the question is not how do I get out of this web? It's how do I structure a good web? What does good society
Mm.
look like? But I remain quite optimistic that in all of these things, in biotech, in AI, in energy, there are good outcomes.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
it's a
yeah.
very exciting time to be alive because the variance of history has suddenly increased so much. But
Mm.
that's also scary, right? Because the variance also means that the lows are also going to be lower. But I do think that with philosophy and proper guidance and understanding of these technologies, there is a good way out.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's a really fascinating answer. Thank you for that. I'm going to go away actually and think about that. People talk online about whether you're taking the white pill or the black pill, whether you're pessimistic or optimistic. And I'm a big advocate of taking the quantum pill, which is a pill that's in a state of superposition between pessimism and optimism. Because as you rightly say, we genuinely don't know what's going to happen in the future, except that we are confronted now with these questions. And I love the idea of essentially using AI not as another person, but as what it actually is, which is a
Crutch.
simulacrum of another person for practice with the real thing, which is just like, I need to contemplate that more. Johnathan, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship, as the fellow said, and I'm looking forward to more of these conversations on and offline. Just tell people to close where they can find your material so that they can go away and check it out.
Yeah, so all of the lectures and interviews are free. You can find everything on greatbooks.io or on my YouTube channel, which just, if you search Johnathan Bi, there's an extra H, John, and B is just BI. That's going to lead you there. Thank you.
Okay, terrific. Thanks a lot. Talk to you soon.